Imagine a world where the echoes of Roman legions have long faded, and the land is now divided between competing tribes, each fighting not only for land, but for the very soul of a new nation. What would it take to unite this fractured land under a single crown? This was the challenge faced by the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans, and the Vikings over centuries, as they battled, adapted, and merged to create medieval England. But the story of this kingdom begins long before 1066, and its legacy would shape not only England, but the very foundations of the modern world. How did a patchwork of tribes with no unified identity evolve into one of Europe's most powerful nations? And how did the bloody battles, alliances, and cultural exchanges of these centuries influence the language, law, and governance we take for granted today? Let's step back to the 5th century, when the mighty Roman Empire crumbled, leaving Britain vulnerable and leaderless. This was a time of incredible upheaval. As the legions withdrew, Britain was left to fend for itself, vulnerable to invasion from beyond the seas. But it wasn't just Viking raiders or Saxon settlers who changed the course of English history. Monks in hidden monasteries, commoners in fields and towns, and peasant rebellions all played a role in shaping this nation's destiny.
One of the most startling truths about medieval England is that the very identity of the English people was built from the turmoil of the ages. The merging of Roman civilization, pagan Anglo-Saxon culture, Christianity, and the Norman feudal system. Take the Saxon king Alfred the Great, who transformed England's approach to warfare, education, and government, or the Viking invaders who left their mark not only with bloodshed, but with the establishment of the Danelaw, where new laws, customs, and cultures blended. These are just fragments of a larger story, a story of cultural alchemy, where each invader and settler left an indelible mark on England's future. Consider, too, the Norman Conquest of 1066, a story not just of knights and kings, but of the reordering of society. William the Conqueror did not simply defeat the Saxon king, he reshaped the very fabric of English life, laying the groundwork for a feudal system that would affect the lives of peasants, barons, and monarchs for generations. Yet the heart of this tale isn't just the battles won or lost. It's about the everyday lives of the people who built, fought, and survived amidst these forces of change. From the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons, to the rise of the English language, to the institutionalization of justice, the people of medieval England carved out a world where identity, faith, and governance became as important as land and riches. But here's a question often overlooked. How did England, a land torn between invaders and settlers, become England at all? What made this mix of cultures and tribes evolve into a kingdom with a distinct identity and lasting power? Was it the sword of the Normans, the pen of the monks, or the slow but steady formation of a common law that forged the modern nation? Through this exploration, we'll uncover not just the famous battles and kings, but the stories that have often remained hidden in the margins of history, the voices of the common folk who lived and loved amid centuries of tumultuous change. Now that you've glimpsed the dramatic transformation of England, its battles, its conquerors, and the people who lived through it, imagine how much you're missing if you don't dive deeper into this fascinating history. If you've made it this far and haven't subscribed yet, are you really ready to be a part of this story? Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from all corners of the world, and it helps us connect. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, tell us why in the comments. We want to know what's holding you back from being part of our growing community. This is your chance to shape the conversation and let us know how we can bring more of the history you crave. Don't leave us hanging. Your voice matters. Imagine waking up one morning and finding the army that had protected your borders for centuries gone.
No warning, no defense, no recourse. The people of Britain woke up to an empire that had turned its back on them in 410 AD. But what happened next wasn't just a collapse. It was the beginning of a transformation that would fracture a continent and lay the groundwork for a new world entirely. In 410 AD, the Roman legions left Britain, but that decision was not the result of a sudden military collapse or mere abandonment. The Roman Empire was under siege from within. Economic instability, political chaos, and barbarian invasions had worn down the once great empire. Britain, then a prosperous and integrated part of the Roman world, was cut loose, left to defend itself with no direction and no support. This wasn't just a military retreat, it was the end of an era. The legions pulled out under the orders of Honorius, the Emperor of the West. His words, "Look to your own defenses," were a cold declaration of Rome's inability to maintain order on the fringes of its empire. And so Britain was left to its own devices, and the once mighty Roman infrastructure began to crumble. As Roman cities decayed and Roman law faded, the economic system that had held Britain together broke down. No longer were trade routes well protected. No longer were markets bustling with Roman goods. Instead, a fragile local economy began to emerge, based on barter, small-scale agriculture, and the scraps of a once thriving world. With the departure of the legions, Britain was left to fend for itself. But who exactly would rise to fill the vacuum left by the Romans? The Romanized Britons had grown accustomed to imperial law, order, and peace. Now the cities were falling apart, and the countryside was exposed to the elements. Those who had once served in the Roman auxiliary, local lords, warriors, and nobles, now had to take on roles of self-protection and survival, but they had no blueprint.
Enter the Germanic tribes. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were already making their way across the North Sea, recruited as mercenaries to defend Roman Britain in the past. They were now turning their swords on Britain itself. But these weren't just barbarian invaders. They were invaders in waves, each tribe bringing their own cultural traditions, language, and forms of governance. The problem? These tribes didn't simply replace Roman Britain. They interacted with it in unpredictable ways. The Anglo-Saxons would shape Britain, but Britain would shape them in turn. For ordinary Britons, the absence of Rome was a disaster. Gone were the grand forums, the bustling markets, the aqueducts, and the roads that made travel and trade possible. What replaced it? A fractured world. In post-Roman Britain, everyday people were no longer protected by the legions. The destruction of urban life left them exposed. What happened to the peasants, merchants, and craftsmen who once depended on Roman order? The survivors had to become their own defenders, their own providers. Without the Roman military and administrative system, Britain had no protection. Local warlords fought for power, while tribal kingdoms began to form out of the chaos.
And yet, amidst this decline, something extraordinary happened. The Anglo-Saxons didn't just invade, they began to settle. Over time, they would mix with the Romano-British populace, leading to a hybrid culture of Germanic warriors and Romanized civilians, one that would eventually give birth to medieval England. The Anglo-Saxons weren't just marauding invaders, they were refugees from their own collapsing homelands. Driven by a combination of economic hardship, overpopulation, and a desire for new lands, these tribes migrated across the North Sea. But what do we really know about their arrival? How did they settle? And what legacy did they leave behind in Britain? Shock insight. The Anglo-Saxons didn't just push out the locals, they interacted with them,
absorbed their traditions, and adapted to the Romanized infrastructure they found. Many Anglo-Saxon settlers quickly learned the Latin language, adopted Roman craftsmanship, and merged their customs with those of the Britons they conquered. This wasn't a complete conquest, it was a cultural exchange. And in that exchange, the world of Roman Britain didn't completely disappear. Elements of Roman law survived, Roman building techniques lingered in the architecture, and Roman religious practices didn't entirely vanish. The Anglo-Saxons, for all their violence, were also part of a long process of integration.
Was Britain doomed to fall, or could it rise again? So, as the Romans left and the Anglo-Saxons moved in, the people of Britain were caught in the middle. The Anglo-Saxons had begun their slow conquest, but could they create a lasting kingdom? Or would they too, like the Romans before them, be swallowed by the chaos they helped create? Stay tuned, because the rise of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms is just the beginning. What happens next is nothing short of revolutionary, and it will change Britain forever. In the wake of Rome's retreat from Britain, the world didn't just fall apart, it was violently reshaped. What came next wasn't a single invasion, but a tide of warriors, settlers, and conquerors sweeping through Britain like a storm, leaving nothing untouched. The Roman Empire, once a pillar of strength, had abandoned its province of Britain in 410 AD. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain had lived under the protective mantle of Roman rule. Now, with no central authority, no military structure, and no unifying government, Britain was ripe for the taking.
The scale of this migration was massive, but what motivated it? Was it simply the pull of land, or was there a deeper force at work? What happened when these tribes collided with the remnants of a Romanized society? As the Anglo-Saxons began to settle, they didn't simply replace the Romans, they began to reshape the land, the people, and the future of Britain. But how far would they go? Could they really create something new, or would they be consumed by the chaos of a fractured world? The Anglo-Saxons were no strangers to conflict. They didn't arrive in peace, they arrived to conquer. And this wasn't a swift overthrow. No, it was a slow, painful process where both sides clashed, adapted, and ultimately integrated. When the Anglo-Saxons settled, they didn't encounter a deserted land. Roman Britain, though weakened and fragmented, still held remnants of Roman power, cities, roads, fortifications, and wealth. The British people, many of them still influenced by Roman culture and Christianity, had to decide, would they fight the invaders or would they join forces with them? But it wasn't just about warfare, it was about adaptation. The Anglo-Saxons, though warriors by nature, also found themselves slowly assimilating into Roman structures. They learned Roman ways, adopted some of their craftsmanship, and even intermarried with the local British population.
But how could these two radically different worlds merge? The Anglo-Saxon society was deeply pagan, built around a warrior code and gods like Woden, Thor, and Frigg. The Romanized Britons, on the other hand, clung to the remnants of Christianity, a faith that had been established across Britain during the Roman occupation. This clash of faiths would be one of the most defining features of the Anglo-Saxon migration. Would the Anglo-Saxons destroy Christianity in Britain, or would they be forced to adopt it themselves? And would the Romans' legacy survive in the hearts and minds of the Britons? As the Anglo-Saxons settled in Britain, tribal kingdoms began to emerge, each with its own identity, customs, and leaders. These weren't unified states yet. They were a patchwork of kingdoms vying for control. Over the course of the 5th to 7th centuries, 4 major kingdoms would rise to prominence: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria,
and Kent.
Wessex would come to dominate in the 9th century under Alfred the Great, but in the 5th and 6th centuries it was merely one of many contenders. Mercia, strategically located in the heart of England, would grow into a powerhouse in the 7th century. Northumbria would become an intellectual and religious center, and Kent, the first to be settled, was the gateway to the island. Each kingdom had its own warrior culture, yet each was also uniquely influenced by the Roman infrastructure and Christianity. These early kingdoms weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for legitimacy. The kings needed more than just armies to rule. They needed support from the people, from the church, and from foreign powers. Language and religion were the threads that would tie these new kingdoms together, and yet also tear them apart. The Anglo-Saxons brought with them a pagan religion, one rooted in the worship of natural forces and warrior gods. This was a culture of warrior elites, where loyalty and courage in battle were the highest virtues. But as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to settle and grow, the Roman legacy of Christianity didn't vanish, it evolved. Missionaries from Rome and Ireland began to infiltrate Anglo-Saxon territory, spreading the Christian faith among the tribes. And what followed wasn't a battle between faiths, it was a slow, cultural transformation.
The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons didn't happen overnight. King Athelbert of Kent converted to Christianity as early as 597 AD, which set the tone for the other kingdoms. But what was at stake wasn't just the spread of Christianity, it was the battle for identity. Were the Anglo-Saxons going to remain pagan warriors or embrace the new ways of life brought by Christianity? Would they remain connected to their Germanic roots, or would they adopt Roman ways in exchange for unity and legitimacy? As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to flourish and grow, could the warrior culture survive in a land that was slowly turning Christian? What would it mean for these tribal identities when the faith of Rome began to take root in the hearts of these once pagan peoples? As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged, one thing became clear: the world of Roman Britain was gone, replaced by a patchwork of new identities. But the question remained: could the Anglo-Saxons rise to become a unified England? And how would the tension between paganism and Christianity, between warrior culture and church authority, shape the fate of these kingdoms? What if the most famous hero of Britain wasn't a mere myth, but a man who led the last charge of a crumbling kingdom? What if King Arthur wasn't just fighting against invaders, he was fighting against time itself, against an inevitable collapse, and against the very forces that would shape the future of Britain?
The figure of King Arthur looms large in the history of Britain, but behind the heroic legend lies a tangled web of historical ambiguity. Was Arthur merely a literary invention, crafted by bards and poets centuries after the supposed events? Or was he a real man, a warrior king who stood against the tidal wave of Anglo-Saxon invasions? The 5th century was a time of monumental upheaval. The Romans had withdrawn, leaving behind a power vacuum. Britain, once a sophisticated part of the Roman Empire, now found itself exposed to a wave of Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The Celtic Britons, fractured into competing tribal kingdoms, found themselves unable to resist the Saxon onslaught. But amidst this chaos, the figure of Arthur emerges. The Welsh monk Gildas wrote about the British struggle against the Saxons, but never mentioned Arthur by name. Yet, his vague descriptions of a great leader who fought to protect Britain point to a military leader rather than a mythical figure. Arthur, as we know him, may have been a Romanized Celtic leader, trained in Roman military tactics, who took command in the face of a fragmented defense.
King Arthur's rise is not just about fighting against an invading force. It's about the last stand of a civilization clinging to its identity its Roman heritage, and its way of life. The myth of Arthur, with his Excalibur, Knights of the Round Table, and the quest for the Holy Grail, represents not just a war against the Saxons, but a war against cultural extinction. The Romanized Britons were not just facing military defeat, they were facing cultural obliteration. The Anglo-Saxons didn't just bring soldiers to battle, they brought their pagan beliefs, their Germanic culture, and their barbarian ways. And yet, Britain was not undefended. The Celts fought back not only with swords, but with their heritage, Christian faith, and the last remnants of Roman infrastructure. Arthur, in many ways, symbolizes this struggle. He is both the last hope of Roman Britain and the symbol of resistance to the unstoppable tide of Saxon invaders. The Round Table, with its egalitarian structure, represents a dying British aristocracy trying to unite disparate Celtic tribes against the invaders. It was not just a fight for land, but a fight for a way of life that was quickly disappearing. But as the tides of history rolled on, could Arthur's final stand ever truly be enough? Or was his struggle just a futile effort to resist the inevitable wave of Saxon domination? Arthur's legendary death at Camlan, in some versions of the tale, was seen as the end of an era. The once great king succumbs to his wounds, the last of the British leaders who could stand against the Saxons. But what does his death really signify? In the Welsh tradition, Arthur didn't die in battle. He was taken to Avalon, the other world, where he would return one day to save Britain. His death could symbolize the death of Roman Britain, but not necessarily the death of its spirit. Was Arthur's fall symbolic of the fall of an empire, or was it the rebirth of a new world, where new leaders would rise to face the coming darkness? The question remains, was Arthur's final battle a tragic end, or was it the beginning of something else, the creation of a new British identity, where the Saxons would eventually be assimilated and a unified English identity would be born?
Regardless of whether King Arthur was a historical figure or a mythical hero, his legacy endures. The legend of Arthur served as a beacon of hope for generations of Britons who faced the loss of their independence. Even after the Anglo-Saxon domination, Arthur's story lived on, embedded deeply in the cultural consciousness of the Welsh, Cornish, and later English peoples. Arthur represented not just military resistance, but cultural resistance. In his pagan ideals, we see the last stand of a people who would be forever changed by the Anglo-Saxons, but whose identity would survive. The English would come to inherit the Arthurian myth, twisting it into a story of chivalry and virtue. But it all began in a time when survival itself seemed impossible. Could Arthur's legacy have been the secret glue that held Britain together after the chaos of the invasions? Was his story more than just a myth, a reflection of the indomitable spirit that would eventually lead to the formation of England as we know it today? Imagine this, an entire civilization that had ruled Britain for centuries, the mighty Romans, vanishes overnight. But in their place comes something equally relentless, a flood of warriors, settlers, and tribes, the Anglo-Saxons, whose arrival would reshape Britain's soul in ways you never imagined.
In the 5th century, Britain found itself at a crossroads, a land abandoned by the Romans, crumbling beneath the pressure of invading Germanic tribes, and yet, at the same time, being molded by the resilience of its native peoples. The Anglo-Saxons, a combination of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, didn't just invade, they settled, intermarried, and adapted to the fractured world they encountered. But what did it mean to be Anglo-Saxon in this new world? To answer that, we need to explore the bedrock of their culture, the warrior ethos. At the heart of Anglo-Saxon society was the war band, a powerful and bonded group of men who lived and fought together under a single leader. These were not just soldiers, but warriors, bound by a code of loyalty and honor. Their lives were shaped by the fealty they owed to their tribal leader, known as the king or warlord. The king's role wasn't just to lead in battle, it was to maintain the health and wealth of the tribe, often in exchange for warriors' loyalty. This warrior culture formed the backbone of what would become Anglo-Saxon England, setting the stage for a society based on the principles of bravery, loyalty, and honor in battle. But it wasn't a simple tribal structure. As they settled on Romanized land, these tribes inherited elements of Roman law, architecture, and bureaucratic systems, blending Roman organization with the Germanic warrior code to form a new, uniquely Anglo-Saxon society. As the Anglo-Saxons set up camp and began to build kingdoms, they found themselves not just fighting to survive, but fighting to shape a future for a fractured Britain. Would their warrior ethos prove sufficient in holding together a land broken into pieces? Could they maintain their warrior culture in the face of powerful Romanized Britons and Viking raids? To truly understand the cultural shift happening in Anglo-Saxon Britain, one must understand the power of oral tradition. For the Anglo-Saxons, stories weren't just entertainment, they were the foundation of their identity. And at the heart of this oral tradition lies Beowulf, the epic poem that remains one of the most significant cultural artifacts of the Anglo-Saxon world. Beowulf is more than just a heroic tale of a monster slayer. It's a reflection of the Anglo-Saxon worldview, where the hero's journey encapsulated the very struggle for survival. Beowulf's fight against Grendel and his mother wasn't just about defeating monsters, it was about defending the social order, honor, and the tribe itself. The poem glorified not just the hero's feats in battle, but also the loyalty and sense of duty that bound society together. The oral storytelling tradition was a vehicle for passing down values like courage, honor, and self-sacrifice to the next generation. The Scops, bards who recited epic poetry, were the guardians of culture, ensuring that the warrior code was passed down through generations. Beowulf's heroic journey mirrored the Anglo-Saxons' own struggle against invaders, against nature, and against the inevitability of death. But the real question is, how long could this pagan warrior ethos last? With Christianity slowly creeping in, would the values of honor, sacrifice, and battle be compromised? Could the Anglo-Saxons reconcile the two forces, their pagan heritage and the new Christian faith? As the Anglo-Saxons made their mark on Britain, their warrior culture began to evolve, but not without resistance. By the 7th century, the Christian missionaries, such as St. Augustine of Canterbury, were making their way into Anglo-Saxon territories. The Anglo-Saxons, who had spent generations forging a warrior society, were now faced with a new dilemma. How could they integrate Christianity, which espoused humility, peace, and mercy, into their warrior ethos? Christianity was more than a religion for the Anglo-Saxons. It was the beginning of a cultural revolution. Christian values did not simply clash with the warrior code, they transformed it. Kings like King Athelbert of Kent, who converted to Christianity in 597 AD, began to align their warrior values with Christian ideals. But the transition was never easy. Christianity introduced monasteries as centers of learning and education, but also a moral code that emphasized charity over battle. How could the Anglo-Saxon warrior spirit survive in a world that began to prioritize peace over war and piety over power? Would Christianity reshape their identity entirely, or could they fuse these seemingly incompatible worlds into a new kind of warrior society? The Anglo-Saxons, though constantly shaped by conflict, were not merely conquerors, they were builders of a society that blended the old and the new. By the time of the Norman Conquest in 1066, the Anglo-Saxon legacy would serve as the foundation for modern England. Their warrior code eventually gave way to a more organized feudal system, while Christianity introduced the concept of law and social order that would later form the basis of English common law. But the heart of the Anglo-Saxon identity remained the warrior spirit, the importance of loyalty, and the idea that one's deeds in battle would define their legacy. As England evolved, so too did the Anglo-Saxon influence, shaping not only the political, but also the cultural foundations of modern Britain.
Imagine a world where every king, warrior, and tribe followed gods of war and power. But what happened when an entirely new faith, one of mercy, peace, and forgiveness, suddenly took root? A faith so powerful it altered not just what people believed, but how they lived, ruled, and governed. Christianity didn't just change Anglo-Saxon England, it redefined it from the inside out. By the 6th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had firmly established their rule across Britain. The Roman Empire had long since collapsed, and the Celts were now fragmented, their lands divided between the remnants of Roman influence and the growing power of the Anglo-Saxon invaders. Paganism was the dominant force. Gods of war like Woden, Thor, and Frigg were the symbols of a world defined by warrior codes and tribal loyalty. The Anglo-Saxon elite, skilled in battle, relied on their pagan beliefs to justify their dominance over the land.
But as these kingdoms fought for supremacy, something monumental was beginning to happen. Christianity, a foreign religion to the Anglo-Saxons, practiced by the Romans and their enemies, began to make inroads into the Anglo-Saxon world. What made this more than just a change in religion was the fact that Christianity was not merely a spiritual force. It came with new ideas about law, governance, and community that would transform the very fabric of Anglo-Saxon England. Could these pagan kings, proud of their warrior culture, embrace a religion that preached mercy over battle, forgiveness over revenge? And what was at stake if they didn't?
Saint Columba, the first to evangelize in Scotland, set the tone for a pagan to Christian transition that was far more gradual than many think. His influence was not simply spiritual, it was also deeply political. Celtic Christianity did not impose new systems of rule in the same way Roman Christianity would, but instead it adapted itself to the local and tribal systems already in place. Through figures like Saint Aidan of Lindisfarne, Christianity began to take root among the Anglo-Saxon elite, most notably in the Kingdom of Northumbria, which would soon become a center of Christian influence. But this wasn't just about belief, it was about political power. For kings like King Edwin of Northumbria, converting to Christianity was not just a spiritual choice, but a political strategy to consolidate power in a kingdom fractured by conflict and external threats. Edwin's conversion, and the subsequent baptisms of his court, was more than an act of faith, it was a calculated move to unify his kingdom under a new spiritual and political order.
In 597 A.D., Pope Gregory the Great dispatched Saint Augustine of Canterbury to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. Augustine's arrival marked the beginning of Roman Christianity's deep integration into Anglo-Saxon life. But it wasn't without challenges. Unlike the Celtic Church, which had roots in the local community, Roman Christianity was connected to papal authority and imposed a top-down structure that many Anglo-Saxon kings were not yet ready to accept. At the Synod of Whitby in 664 A.D., a critical battle between Celtic and Roman Christianity took place. The Synod was a clash of cultures. Celtic Christians, who celebrated Easter on a different date, and Roman missionaries, who aligned with papal authority and followed a different set of practices. The Synod's decision to align with Roman Christianity was monumental. It solidified the authority of the Pope in Anglo-Saxon England, ushering in a new era where the Roman Church would influence everything from politics to law. With Roman Christianity now firmly entrenched in Anglo-Saxon England, could the faith maintain its hold as the dominant force in a land where pagan beliefs and Celtic customs still had a powerful grip?
The conversion to Christianity was not simply about adopting a new set of beliefs. It was a cultural transformation. Pagan shrines were destroyed and churches began to replace them. The pagan gods that once commanded the loyalty of the Anglo-Saxon kings and warriors were replaced by Christian saints and church leaders. But the transition was slow. The pagan warrior code, with its emphasis on bravery and honor in battle, could not simply vanish. In fact, many of the early Anglo-Saxon kings, King Alfred the Great, for instance, continued to embrace both Christianity and the warrior ethos, blending the two in a way that would eventually shape the English identity. The early Christian monasteries, such as those at Lindisfarne, were not just spiritual centers. They became cultural hubs where learning, artistry, and political influence flourished. Christianity's gradual adoption had a profound impact on law as well. The Anglo-Saxon legal system became increasingly Christianized, moving away from the retributive justice of the warrior code to a system of laws based on Christian morality, values of mercy, forgiveness, and justice.
As Christianity reshaped the Anglo-Saxon world, how would these transformations, religious, social, and political, redefine the very identity of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms? The conversion to Christianity was more than just a change in faith for the Anglo-Saxons. It was a cultural revolution that impacted everything from art to governance. Christianity's arrival brought with it not just religion, but new ways of living, ruling, and understanding the world. It reshaped the legal system, monarchy, and social structures, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the English nation. But even as Christianity gained strength, the pagan warrior ethos still resonated deeply in the Anglo-Saxon psyche. The warrior kings of the early medieval period, such as King Alfred the Great, exemplified the marriage of Christianity with the warrior ideals that had once defined their ancestors. Picture a land broken into a dozen warring kingdoms, each with its own king, each fighting for supremacy. Then imagine a single figure rising not just to defeat invaders, but to reshape the very fabric of the Anglo-Saxon world. How did one leader, King Alfred, turn a fractured, vulnerable England into a nation poised to become one of Europe's most powerful empires?
By the late 9th century, Anglo-Saxon England was anything but unified. The land was a patchwork of competing kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Kent. The Vikings, fierce warriors from Denmark and Norway, had already begun their rampage, launching raids that had devastated the Anglo-Saxon world. The Danelaw, an area controlled by Viking settlers, had already been carved out in the north, and the Viking menace seemed to have only grown more powerful. The pagan kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons had a strong warrior culture, but that didn't prepare them for the Viking onslaught. The Danish army had no loyalty to the old gods, the warrior codes, or even to a single king. They operated with a differently structured society, one based on plunder and quick raids, rather than the slow consolidation of land and power. By 871 AD, much of England had been conquered, and the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were on the verge of collapse. However, in the chaos of Viking invasion, a figure would rise, a king who would not only fight back, but would forge a new identity for the Anglo-Saxon people. King Alfred's rise to power was more than just military, it was strategic. But could he truly transform a fragmented pagan land into a unified Christian kingdom? What would it take to break the long-standing tribal divisions?
When Alfred the Great became King of Wessex in 871, he faced an impossible task. The kingdom was in shambles, its borders threatened by both Viking armies and internal division. But Alfred was more than just a military strategist, he was a visionary. Recognizing that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms couldn't survive without unity, Alfred sought to centralize power under one banner. Rather than simply fighting the Viking invaders, Alfred worked to reorganize his forces and fortify the kingdom. He developed a network of fortified towns, called burhs, that could withstand Viking raids and provide safe havens for peasants and traders. Alfred's military reforms turned Wessex into the strongest Anglo-Saxon kingdom and laid the foundation for a more unified England. But Alfred knew that military might alone would not unify the land. His centralization efforts were also political. King Alfred created a system of alliance building with neighboring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and secured his own line of succession. His efforts would eventually lead to the formation of a single Anglo-Saxon kingdom, united not by war alone, but by the common need to defend against Viking domination.
Was Alfred's vision of a unified kingdom enough to overcome centuries of tribal divisions, or would the old loyalties and regional power struggles eventually fracture his legacy? As Alfred consolidated his kingdom politically and militarily, the economic recovery of Anglo-Saxon England became a crucial aspect of the political consolidation process. In an era where Viking raids had crippled agricultural production and trade, monasteries became centers of economic and intellectual revival. Monasteries weren't just religious centers, they were the economic engines that kept the Anglo-Saxon world moving forward. The monastic system, inspired by Benedictine rules, organized land into productive agricultural units, built trade networks, and provided safe havens during Viking raids. Lindisfarne and Jarrow, two of the most famous monastic centers, became hubs of art and learning. These monasteries also acted as centers for the preservation of classical knowledge, maintaining libraries and scribal practices that would later influence medieval scholarship.
The economic revival didn't stop with agriculture and intellectual pursuits. It extended to trade, both domestic and international. Anglo-Saxon England began to trade with continental Europe, Scandinavia, and the Mediterranean, exchanging wool, gold, and silver for wine, luxury goods, and foreign texts. Monasteries often acted as intermediaries in this trade, holding land, controlling currency, and ensuring the flow of goods across borders. But as the monasteries grew in wealth and influence, could they maintain their neutrality in a kingdom struggling for centralized control? Or would their wealth become a point of contention between the growing power of the monarchs and the church? One of the most significant legacies of the political consolidation during Alfred's reign was the introduction of early legal codes. Before Alfred, the Anglo-Saxons had no unified legal system. Laws were typically enforced at a tribal level, with local lords deciding disputes and administering justice. However, with the rise of a centralized monarchy, Alfred the Great sought to implement a more standardized system of justice.
Alfred's legal code, the Dooms, was a remarkable fusion of traditional Anglo-Saxon customs, Christian principles, and Roman law. It was not only a set of laws, but also a moral framework that emphasized the protection of the weak, the importance of oaths, and the necessity of upholding social order. Alfred's laws were transformed over time, and his successors, such as King Athelstan, continued to build on this foundation. Alfred's influence on English common law is often underestimated, but the Dooms would become the groundwork for the legal systems that would be built in medieval England and eventually influence the development of English common law in the centuries to follow. Would the introduction of centralized law and legal uniformity be enough to hold the kingdom together? Or would local power and feudal allegiances continue to pose a challenge to the kingdom's unity? By the time of King Athelstan, the process of unification begun by Alfred the Great had reached its apex. The Viking invasions were pushed back, trade flourished, and a centralized legal system began to take root. England, once a collection of fractured kingdoms, had become the foundation for what would eventually be known as medieval England.
Alfred's vision of a unified England under a single kingdom, grounded in law and Christianity, became the legacy of Wessex and later the English monarchy. But his work was not without challenges. The Viking threat, the growing influence of the monasteries, and the internal divisions within Anglo-Saxon society would continue to shape the future of England for generations. What if I told you that Alfred the Great, a king often remembered for his military triumphs, was not only one of the greatest warriors in history, but also a deeply intellectual and spiritually driven ruler, whose influence over England has been so profound his impact can still be felt today? By the time Alfred the Great ascended to the throne in 871 AD, Wessex, the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, was under constant siege by the Viking Great Heathen Army. England was a fragmented land, and the Viking presence was not merely a series of raids, it was an existential threat to Anglo-Saxon culture, law, and civilization. For nearly a century, the Danes had terrorized England's coastlines, and by the time Alfred took the throne, the Vikings controlled large swaths of England, including Northumbria, parts of Mercia, and the Danelaw in the north. But Alfred's rise was not destined. His early life was marred by internal conflict within Wessex, and his path to power was filled with challenges. The young Alfred had to not only contend with the Vikings, but also navigate the divisions within his own kingdom. Alfred's first years as king were marked by continuous Viking raids, but it was his strategic insight and his deep sense of duty to his people that would define his reign. Alfred understood that if the Vikings were to be defeated and England was to survive, it wouldn't be through brute force alone. The real question was, could he unify the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under a single banner? Could he inspire his people to resist not just the Vikings, but the culture of fear and division that had plagued them for years? Alfred didn't just want to win battles, he wanted to transform his kingdom. But was his vision of a unified Christian England achievable? Or was he simply postponing the inevitable Viking takeover? Unlike many of his contemporaries, Alfred was not merely a warrior king, he was a strategic genius. Faced with the Viking threat, Alfred realized that he couldn't rely on traditional tribal allegiances and feudal structures to defeat the invaders. He had to create a standing army that could respond to threats quickly. Alfred's military reforms were revolutionary for the time. He established a system of burhs, fortified towns strategically placed throughout Wessex. These burhs were designed to provide safe havens for the people and act as strongholds to repel Viking raids. But they also had a deeper purpose. They would serve as administrative centers, places where people from different parts of the kingdom could come together, exchange ideas, and strengthen the fabric of a unified kingdom. Alfred's system of fortification, combined with well-organized military training, allowed him to fight not just defensively, but strategically. Under Alfred, Wessex developed a professional army, including freemen who had a stake in defending their land, rather than relying solely on a noble-led army. This would become a key element in the survival and expansion of Alfred's influence in the face of overwhelming odds.
But as the Viking threat grew more sophisticated, Alfred's ability to hold Wessex together would be tested. Would his defensive strategy be enough to save the kingdom, or would the power of the Viking invaders prove too much? In 878 AD,
Alfred faced his greatest test. The Viking Great Heathen Army, led by Guthrum, had invaded Wessex and had captured London. Alfred's forces had been forced into hiding, retreating to the marshlands of Athelney, a place of refuge that would later become symbolic of Alfred's resilience. In an extraordinary display of military genius, Alfred regrouped, rebuilt his forces, and launched a counterattack. At the Battle of Edington, Alfred's army faced the Vikings in what would become one of the most significant military confrontations of the medieval period. Against the odds, Alfred's forces defeated Guthrum's army, securing Wessex's survival. But Alfred did not stop at the battlefield. After his victory, he forced Guthrum to negotiate a treaty, the Treaty of Wedmore, which divided England into Viking-controlled and Anglo-Saxon-controlled territories, providing a temporary but essential peace. Guthrum also converted to Christianity, symbolizing the shift in England from pagan Viking rule to a Christian Anglo-Saxon future.
But as the Treaty of Wedmore provided peace, was it a temporary fix, or was this Alfred's one chance to solidify his vision of a unified England under Christian rule? Alfred's reign was not just about military conquest, it was also a cultural revolution. Faced with the threat of Viking cultural domination, Alfred worked to revitalize Anglo-Saxon culture. He understood that to resist the Viking forces, he needed to nourish the spirit of his people, to connect them to their past and future through education, law, and culture. Alfred established a network of schools, promoting literacy and learning, and he took a personal interest in education. Having struggled with illiteracy as a young man, Alfred valued learning and made it accessible. He famously translated several Latin texts into Old English, including works by Boethius and Gregory the Great, making important philosophical and theological works available to his people. This wasn't just about education, it was about creating a cultural identity that could resist the foreign influence of the Vikings.
In addition to fostering education, Alfred also established the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a key historical record of England. The Chronicle documented the struggles and triumphs of Alfred's reign, preserving the Anglo-Saxon identity in the face of Viking aggression. This document would become essential not only for later English monarchs, but for the formation of England's national identity. Could Alfred's vision of a literary, intellectual kingdom survive beyond his death? Would his reforms last? Or would the Viking threat tear the fragile cultural unity he worked so hard to build? Alfred the Great's reign marked a profound shift in the history of England. Not only did he defeat the Viking invaders, but he laid the foundations for the unification of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. His efforts in military reform, education, and law created a framework for England's future, a future that would endure long after his death.
Through his military strategy, diplomatic treaties, and commitment to intellectual progress, Alfred shaped a unified Anglo-Saxon identity, preserving it against both internal and external threats. Though his successors would face new challenges, the legacy of Alfred, the first true king of England, remained a guiding force. What if I told you the story of the Viking invasion wasn't just about plunder, but about survival, identity, and assimilation? Picture an invading force so powerful that not only did it take land, but it transformed the very soul of England. But in the end, the Vikings didn't just conquer, they built and became part of the land they invaded. What happens when a conquered people eventually becomes the conqueror?
The Viking Age, 793 to 1066 AD, is often painted with a broad brush of fear and destruction. Vikings are traditionally depicted as ruthless raiders, sailing from Scandinavia to pillage and conquer. But the truth is much more complex and far more fascinating.
These invaders were not just marauding pirates, but skilled seafarers and cultural pioneers seeking to establish new homes and claim new lands. By the 8th century, Scandinavia was overcrowded and its resources stretched thin. The Vikings weren't just looking to invade, they were seeking new territories, trade routes, and wealth. The discovery of England, with its rich monasteries and fertile lands, became an irresistible target. But what started as sporadic raids would eventually lead to the formation of the Danelaw, a region in England that would be ruled by Viking settlers and remain under Viking control for centuries. The first Viking raids began in 793 AD with the infamous attack on Lindisfarne, a peaceful Christian monastery that had little defense against the well-organized Viking ships. From that point on, the raids would escalate, and Vikings began to establish strongholds along the coast of England.
But what's rarely discussed is that these raids evolved into full-scale invasions. By 860 AD, the Vikings were no longer just striking and fleeing. They were setting up permanent colonies and replacing local kings with Viking rulers. But why did the Vikings stay? Were they driven solely by greed, or was there something more personal, a desire to make a new home? And how did the Anglo-Saxons react when the Vikings stopped being raiders and became rulers? The Danelaw wasn't just a military conquest. It was the birth of a new cultural and legal identity. By the time King Guthrum established the Danelaw in 879 AD, the Vikings had already settled, creating a region where Danish laws, customs, and pagan practices were the norms. The Danelaw covered vast portions of northeast and central England, including Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. The Vikings didn't simply raise the lands, they settled, intermarried, and built societies from the ground up. They established towns and villages, built fortresses, and in many cases, integrated with the local Anglo-Saxon populations. This wasn't just an invasion, it was an infiltration and assimilation of Viking culture into Anglo-Saxon society.
As Viking leaders like King Sweyn Forkbeard and King Canute the Great expanded their territory, the Danelaw began to exert influence over large parts of England. Anglo-Saxon kings like Alfred the Great might have fought hard to resist Viking rule, but the Vikings were not just conquerors, they were builders of a new Anglo-Scandinavian identity. But how did the Viking settlers adapt to a land already inhabited by a strong Anglo-Saxon culture? Could they ever truly integrate? Or would the deep-rooted Anglo-Saxon values and the rise of Christianity lead to an inevitable conflict? For the common people of Anglo-Saxon England, the Viking raids were not just another chapter in a historical textbook. They were terrifying, life-altering events. Imagine, for a moment, living in a small village along the coast, surrounded by families and neighbors. The year is 800 AD. The sun is just rising, and suddenly you hear the sound of drums, the clatter of armor, and the terrifying sight of Viking longships on the horizon.
For Anglo-Saxon farmers and villagers, Viking raids meant everything could be taken away. Cattle, grain, houses, and most terrifyingly, family members. The Vikings were notorious for taking slaves, especially young women and children. The fear was constant, and the threat of destruction was always near. For the Vikings, the raids were not just acts of savagery. They were acts of survival. Life in Scandinavia was harsh, with long winters, overcrowding, and land that could barely sustain its people. Viking raids were about securing resources and establishing new lives. They weren't just looking for treasure, they were seeking land that could provide them with a future. The Viking worldview was shaped by the necessity of survival,
not just conquest. Were the Vikings as brutal as history suggests, or was their violence a necessary evil in the fight for land and security? How did these men, often branded as barbarians, forge their own path to becoming rulers of a foreign land? As the Vikings settled into the Danelaw, their influence permeated nearly every aspect of life. The Viking legal system, with its emphasis on personal liberty, land ownership, and settlement rights, was implemented across the northeast and central England. Many Anglo-Saxons, forced to live under Viking rule, adopted Danish customs, married Viking settlers, and embraced their new rulers. Yet there remained a sharp divide between the Anglo-Saxons in the south and the Viking-controlled north. The question of identity and loyalty persisted long after the last Viking invaders were repelled. The cultural integration of the Vikings into England is still felt today, with numerous place names of Danish origin dotting the English countryside. But as the Viking power waned and the Norman Conquest loomed in 1066, the question remained: would the Viking legacy be absorbed into the growing Anglo-Norman society, or would it continue to define the north of England for centuries to come?
Thank you for sticking with us so far. It means a lot. We've unraveled the depths of history, and we're only getting started. But let me ask you this. How much of what we've discussed so far surprised you? Was history really told the way you thought it was? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love hearing your perspective. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, what's holding you back? The best is yet to come. Join us on this journey of discovery.
In the spring of 1066, England was on the brink of transformation. But the cause was not a single king's ambition, nor was it a choice between rightful heirs. It was a world where broken oaths, family legacies, and political maneuvering collided, each one pulling the kingdom in different directions. And at the heart of it all was a man with no right to rule, a kingdom that was already fractured, and a battle that would change the very fabric of England. The death of Edward the Confessor in 1066 didn't just mark the end of his reign, it marked the collapse of the political structures that had kept Anglo-Saxon England together for over a century. Edward's reign, although peaceful in many ways, was deeply insecure. He had no children to succeed him, and in his final years he made no clear decision about who should follow him on the throne. The Anglo-Saxon monarchy was traditionally one of elective kingship. Often, the Witan, the Council of Nobles, chose the successor. However, Edward's indecisiveness led to the breakdown of this practice.
Harold Godwinson, the most powerful Anglo-Saxon noble, claimed that Edward had named him as successor on his deathbed, but Edward's own actions, including his exile in Normandy and a close relationship with William of Normandy, cast doubt on this. In fact, Edward's reliance on Norman advisors and his preference for Norman influence in his later years might have shaped the destiny of England in ways even he didn't foresee. Edward's political weakness, however, was compounded by the Viking ambition of Harald Hardrada, a king from the north who sought to restore Viking dominance in England. Hardrada's claim came through his ancestor, King Canute, who had once ruled England. But more than that, it was about the Viking dream, a dream of dominion over the lands that once belonged to their ancestors. Could Harold's claim survive in the face of two powerful invaders with legitimate claims of their own? Was England truly Harold's to defend?
The conflict between Harold Godwinson and William of Normandy went far beyond the vows and promises made between them. Harold's oath to William in 1064 during a visit to Normandy was sworn under duress, but it was also seen as an act of loyalty. Harold's claim to the throne was supported by the English nobility, but William's claim was equally strong, rooted not just in a promise, but in the bloodline of the English monarchy. For William, the Norman invasion wasn't just about power, it was about legitimacy. Edward the Confessor had promised the throne to William, and by extension, William was the rightful heir. The Norman kingdom had prospered under William's father, and William believed that he was the only one with the strength, resources, and right to rule both England and Normandy. He sought to unite these two realms, one that had been growing more Norman through Edward's reign, and one that had been a source of discontent among its Saxon rulers. In contrast, Harold's claim was based on the right of inheritance. He was English, he had helped Edward defend England, and he had been the first to act in response to the throne's vacancy. Edward's death had not just disrupted the monarchy, it had shattered the delicate balance between power and nobility. Harold, however, was not universally accepted. But was Harold's rightful claim enough to rally all of England's fractured kingdoms behind him, or would William's Norman might overwhelm them all?
While the Norman conflict escalated in the south, in the north, Harald Hardrada was amassing a Viking force to claim the throne. Hardrada's ambitions were not merely about personal gain. They were about reviving Viking power and glory in England, where Viking kings had once ruled and claimed dominion. Hardrada's invasion at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, was the final Viking assault on England. Hardrada's forces faced off against Harold Godwinson's exhausted army, which had marched north after hearing of the Viking landing. In a stunning battle, Harold Godwinson emerged victorious, and Hardrada was slain. This decisive victory not only ended the Viking threat to England, but also marked the end of the Viking Age in the British Isles. But Hardrada's invasion left a hollow victory for Harold. The battle had drained Harold's resources, and the Viking threat was replaced by a more dangerous one, William of Normandy. Harold had just defeated one enemy. Could he now face the looming Norman invasion with an army too weakened to withstand the onslaught?
The Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, would become one of the most defining moments in English history. For William, the conflict was not just about a kingdom, it was about control of a continent. For Harold, it was about protecting the legacy of Anglo-Saxon England. The Norman Conquest was far more than a military victory. It was the beginning of a feudal revolution that would reshape English society. The Normans introduced a new social order, built massive castles, and laid the foundations for the English monarchy as we know it today. But the question remained, how much of Anglo-Saxon England would survive? Would the Norman influence completely eclipse the Saxon culture? Or would the two worlds eventually meld together to create something new? In 1066, England wasn't just fighting for a throne, it was fighting for its very soul. Imagine two worlds separated by centuries of history, clashing on a single field. The fate of a kingdom rested on the strength of swords, cavalry, and psychological warfare, with the future of an ancient culture hanging in the balance. This was not just a battle, it was the end of an era and the beginning of a new world.
By 1066, England was already a land teetering on the edge of political fragmentation. Edward the Confessor's reign had ended in uncertainty, with no clear heir and no consensus among the Anglo-Saxon Witan, Council of Nobles, about the rightful successor. Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, had claimed the throne, supported by the nobility. Yet William of Normandy also laid claim, bolstered by an oath he argued Harold had sworn during a visit to Normandy years earlier. Meanwhile, Harold Hardrada, the last Viking king, seized the moment to launch an invasion from the north, claiming his inheritance based on Viking ancestry and long-standing ties to the Anglo-Saxon royal family. As Harold prepared for his coronation, he was faced with not one but two competing invasions, one in the north by Hardrada and another from the south by William. Harold's decision to march north to confront Hardrada while leaving his southern defenses vulnerable would have dire consequences. But William, too, faced a political and military challenge. His forces, though smaller, were equipped with the innovations that would define the future of warfare. With Norman feudal cavalry and archers, William's army was prepared to wage a battle unlike anything the Anglo-Saxons had seen.
But how could Harold's tried-and-true shield wall, a defensive formation built over centuries of Anglo-Saxon warfare, withstand the speed and psychological tactics of a force like William's? And could Harold, having just defeated one foreign invasion, survive the other? The Anglo-Saxon shield wall was a testament to traditional warfare, a formation of heavily armored infantry standing shoulder to shoulder, holding ground with large shields, spears, and battle axes. The idea was simple: stop the enemy from breaking through, no matter the cost. The Anglo-Saxons relied on defensive strength, with warriors who were fiercely loyal and battle-hardened from years of conflict. In stark contrast, the Norman army was a product of feudal innovation. William's knights, heavily armored cavalry, were mounted and far more mobile than the Anglo-Saxon infantry. The use of archers, infantry, and cavalry allowed for a level of coordination that the Anglo-Saxons had not yet developed. But perhaps the most crucial element in William's strategy was his psychological warfare, specifically the feigned retreat.
The feigned retreat was more than a tactic. It was a calculated attempt to break the Anglo-Saxon discipline. When the Norman cavalry first charged, they were repelled. But after a quick retreat, they turned around to attack the now exposed Anglo-Saxon forces, who had abandoned their shield wall in pursuit. This moment marked the beginning of the end for the Anglo-Saxons, who had always relied on stability in their lines. With the Anglo-Saxon shield wall crumbling and their forces scattered, could Harold's leadership hold the line? Or was the Norman cavalry simply too strong, too mobile, and too psychologically astute? The Norman army, though smaller, was trained in the art of combined arms, infantry, archers, and cavalry working in tandem. The Norman archers played a key role, constantly harassing the shield wall and forcing the Anglo-Saxons to remain static. Meanwhile, the cavalry, led by William, used the feigned retreat to lure the English forces out of their formation. The Norman cavalry was heavily armored, but it was the speed of their maneuvering that set them apart from the slower Anglo-Saxon infantry. William's ability to adapt on the battlefield, constantly shifting tactics to break the Anglo-Saxon lines, showed the power of Norman innovation in medieval warfare. The combination of archers, cavalry, and infantry was a precursor to modern tactics, a multi-layered approach that would soon dominate European battlefields. The Anglo-Saxon defense was shattered, but Harold still stood at the front, rallying his men. How would Harold's death shape the psychological state of his men, and would it push them toward victory or despair? The death of Harold Godwinson was both symbolic and strategic. As the king who had led his forces through years of conflict, his death shattered not just the English military, but the moral fabric of the Anglo-Saxon resistance. Harold's leadership had been the glue that held the Anglo-Saxon kingdom together, but his demise marked the psychological collapse of the shield wall and the Anglo-Saxon resolve. William's victory at Hastings wasn't just about breaking through a military formation. It was about breaking the spirit of England. Harold's death, immortalized in the Bayeux tapestry, is shown as a turning point where the once mighty Anglo-Saxon resistance crumbled. In the aftermath, the Normans would impose a new social order, transforming England's land distribution, its language, its law, and its culture. The feudal system, the Domesday Book,
and the Normanization of England began in the wake of this battle. Anglo-Saxon elites were replaced by Norman lords, and Norman French became the language of the court.
But as England's culture, laws, and noble families were forever altered, could the Anglo-Saxon identity survive in this new world? Or would the Norman rule wash over the island, leaving only a faint memory of the once great Anglo-Saxon kingdom? In the cold light of December 1066, as William of Normandy ascended to the throne of England, it wasn't just the end of an Anglo-Saxon reign, it was the birth of an entirely new world order. The coronation of William wasn't a peaceful transition, it was a violent cultural coup, one that would shake the very foundations of England's society, economy, and religion. But how did the English, a people with a deep-seated tradition, cope with the sudden imposition of Norman rule? The story doesn't end with the battle for the throne. It's in the aftermath that the true transformation of England unfolds. When William the Conqueror was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, the act was not just a matter of tradition. Christmas, a day celebrating the birth of Christ, became the perfect symbolic backdrop for William's conquest. In the eyes of the Normans, it wasn't simply a political victory, it was a divinely ordained shift in the balance of power. By choosing this sacred day, William sought to underscore the message that his kingship was God's will, and that his conquest of England was not only political, but also spiritual.
However, this coronation was not universally accepted. The Anglo-Saxon nobility had sworn loyalty to Harold Godwinson, and many saw William as nothing more than a foreign invader. While William's reign was secured by Norman soldiers, his legitimacy needed to be reinforced by symbolism. The moment William knelt at the altar of Westminster Abbey and swore to uphold the laws of England, he wasn't just becoming the king, he was marking the end of an era. Anglo-Saxon England was dead. The new England would be shaped by a Norman vision of law, culture, and power. Yet, the coronation was just the beginning. William's hold on England would be anything but secure. Would the Anglo-Saxons, who had lost their king and their culture, accept this new Norman order? Or would resistance simmer beneath the surface, ready to explode at the slightest sign of weakness? To solidify his control, William introduced feudalism, a social and economic system that was alien to the Anglo-Saxon way of life. Feudalism meant that land ownership was granted to vassals in exchange for loyalty and military service. In the wake of Harold's defeat, William seized the lands of the defeated Anglo-Saxon nobles and redistributed them to his Norman followers. This feudal structure was meant to ensure that William's loyalists held the kingdom's resources and that discontent was kept in check.
But feudalism didn't just reallocate land, it transformed England's social structure. For the Anglo-Saxon nobility, it meant the loss of ancestral lands that had been passed down for generations. Some were forced into exile, others subjugated to new Norman lords. The Norman elite, now in charge of the lands, took advantage of the system to amass wealth and establish their own dynasties. For the common people, serfdom and peasants' rights were drastically affected. Peasants now worked the land, but instead of answering to Anglo-Saxon lords, they were bound to Norman barons who were enforcing the feudal system. This was the beginning of a long-standing divide in English society, one where the Anglo-Saxon commoners would eventually find themselves increasingly isolated from the Norman elite. As the Norman barons tightened their grip on the land, could the Anglo-Saxon resistance overcome the newly imposed feudal system? Or would it be a slow, inevitable surrender to the foreign rulers? While William's coronation symbolized the beginning of the Norman reign, it was the Doomsday Book of 1085 that solidified the Normans' absolute control over England.
The Domesday Book, a comprehensive survey of all the lands and resources in England, was an unprecedented tool of centralized government. It was the first massive, state-sponsored registry of land ownership, economic value, and population data.
More than just a census, the Domesday Book was a tool to enforce taxation and keep track of land ownership. This monumental survey allowed William to determine exactly how much revenue each manorial estate could generate, ensuring he could extract taxes to fund his own wars, maintain his military, and consolidate power. For the Anglo-Saxon peasants, the Domesday Book was a reminder that they were now subjects in a world where every piece of land was accounted for by royal authority. In fact, the Domesday Book was not just an administrative tool, it was a symbol of power. It represented the shift from Anglo-Saxon landholding traditions to Norman control. Every entry in the book was a mark of Norman authority, a record of William's total domination of the English landscape. But as the Normans solidified their control through the Domesday Book, what would become of the Anglo-Saxon traditions that had once defined England? Was there any chance of rebellion? Or would the Norman regime simply absorb everything into its own feudal order?
The immediate aftermath of the Norman Conquest wasn't just about military victory, it was about social transformation. William's introduction of feudalism and the creation of the Domesday Book changed not only the political landscape, but also the economic, social, and cultural fabric of England. This period saw the rise of a new England, one where the Norman crown exercised total control and the Anglo-Saxon nobility was pushed to the margins. The land, the people, and the very structure of society were all reshaped under Norman rule. But while the Normans won the battle for England, the war for cultural dominance was far from over. Resistance would simmer, and over time, Anglo-Saxon traditions would continue to influence the Norman rulers, creating a complex, hybrid society. This merger of cultures would lay the foundation for the medieval English identity that we know today, shaped by both Norman influence and Anglo-Saxon heritage. By Christmas Day 1066, William the Conqueror had not just won a kingdom, he had set in motion a transformation so profound that it would reshape the very language, architecture, and soul of England. From the ashes of Anglo-Saxon culture, a new identity began to form, one that fused the old ways with the foreign and the alien. But what happens when a whole people are forced to live in a world of subjugation, invasion, and cultural domination? And how did the Anglo-Saxon spirit persist beneath the weight of Norman rule?
After William of Normandy was crowned King of England in 1066, his reign was not just about establishing a new dynasty, it was about replacing the entire framework of English society, culture, and governance. Anglo-Saxon England, with its deeply rooted Germanic customs, laws, and traditions, had been defeated not just militarily, but also culturally. The Norman elite would impose their language, religion, and administrative structure on a conquered people. But the true story of the Norman conquest goes far beyond the battlefield. William's reign marked the beginning of Anglo-Norman England, a fusion of two distinct cultures that would evolve over centuries. The Normans brought with them French, Romanesque architecture, and a feudal system that replaced Anglo-Saxon egalitarian traditions. Meanwhile, the common people, still deeply attached to Old English, would find their lives radically changed, their old ways of living and thinking challenged by a new, foreign reality. But as the Norman architecture rose across the land and French words infiltrated the daily speech of England, could the Anglo-Saxon culture survive the onslaught of change? Would William's triumph lead to the permanent disintegration of a proud civilization, Or would the old world fight back beneath the surface?
The most profound and lasting impact of the Norman conquest was the linguistic revolution it sparked. Before 1066, Old English was the language of the people, from the common farmers to the noble warriors. But with William's victory, Norman French became the language of power, government, and church. In the royal court, the English nobility spoke French, and this linguistic divide was central to the social stratification of Norman England. But the fusion of Old English and Norman French didn't result in a simple language swap. It gave birth to Middle English, a hybrid language that reflected the cultural fusion between the old Anglo-Saxon world and the new Norman order. Over time, French influenced English vocabulary, introducing terms related to law, government, and society. But Old English remained the language of the common people, the farmers and the laborers. The upper classes and intellectual elites embraced Norman French, while the lower classes retained their Anglo-Saxon speech. This created a linguistic hierarchy. The language of law and culture was French, while the language of the land and labor was still Old English. The split between the elite and the commoner was solidified not just by land, but by language itself, creating a permanent social divide.
Yet Middle English would eventually rise as a common language, mixing the old Anglo-Saxon roots with the French influence and shaping the future of English. Words like court, council, and council came from French, while house, wife, and child remained rooted in Old English. But it wasn't just about vocabulary. It was about the cultural integration of two worlds that would forever influence literature, law, and society. As Middle English emerged, could the Anglo-Saxon identity survive in this new world? Would the old ways, the culture, the values, the history be entirely erased? Or would they persist in hidden places, influencing the very heart of Norman society? The Normans didn't just invade England, they remade it. One of the most visible symbols of their rule was the castle. These stone fortresses were not just military strongholds, they were the centers of power. Places where Norman barons could impose their control over the English countryside. William's military campaigns had been brutal, but now his focus shifted to consolidating power through architecture.
The Norman castles, which sprung up across the landscape, were more than just defensive structures. They were symbols of dominance, silent sentinels over the land. Each castle was a reminder to the English people that their kingdom had been overtaken, and they were now subjects under a new, foreign ruler. The feudal system, which William introduced, ensured that Norman lords controlled vast tracts of land, while Anglo-Saxon nobility was either displaced or forced into servitude. Along with castles, the Normans also brought with them a distinctive Romanesque architecture, which was most evident in the churches they built. Norman cathedrals, with their massive stone walls and rounded arches, were intended not just as places of worship, but as symbols of the new order. The church became a central part of Norman governance as Norman bishops and abbots took control of key religious institutions. For the common people, this architectural shift was more than just a change in style. It was a reminder of their subjugation. The old Anglo-Saxon structures were replaced with grand Norman constructions, and the religion they had practiced under their own Anglo-Saxon bishops was now controlled by Norman clergy loyal to the king. While the Norman castles and cathedrals transformed the landscape, what happened to the Old English customs? Would the people rebel against this architectural and cultural domination, or would they accept this new world as the inevitable reality?
The most devastating impact of Norman rule was on the common people. The feudal system replaced the relatively egalitarian Anglo-Saxon society, which had been based on local governance and more autonomous landholding. Under the Normans,
land became the property of the king, and it was then dispersed to his Norman vassals in exchange for military service. For the peasants, the backbone of English society, this meant a loss of freedom. No longer could they hold land and make decisions on their own. They were now serfs, bound to the land they worked, with no possibility of leaving without the permission of their Norman lords. William's imposition of serfdom was brutal. People were bound by debt, forced to pay high rents, and controlled by the new aristocracy. The peasants who had once had more freedom under Anglo-Saxon rule found themselves subjugated and exploited under the feudal system. Yet, this wasn't a smooth transition. Across the countryside, rebellion and resistance brewed. The harrying of the North, in which William's forces burned villages, slaughtered people, and destroyed crops, was one of the most brutal acts of repression in English history. The Anglo-Saxons weren't just conquered, they were punished. With the feudal system in place and the Anglo-Saxons struggling under the weight of Norman rule, would the people rise up in rebellion once more? Or would the Normans succeed in quashing any hope of resistance?
The Norman Conquest didn't simply change England's government or ruling class. It reshaped the identity of the English people, blending the old Anglo-Saxon roots with the new Norman influence. Over the centuries, Norman French and Old English would merge to form Middle English, and the feudal system would evolve into something uniquely English. The castles and cathedrals that dotted the landscape stood as silent reminders of a conquered kingdom, but they also marked the beginning of a new chapter in English history, one that was still deeply connected to its Anglo-Saxon past. The Anglo-Saxons did not disappear. Their resilience, their language, and their customs would survive. Though subtly transformed, they would continue to shape the future of England. And in this quiet cultural fusion, the Norman Conquest began to lose its foreignness, becoming, over time, the foundation of the English identity that we know today.
In 1066, the sword of William the Conqueror didn't just carve a new monarch for England, it carved a new identity. But the true battle had just begun. The Norman Conquest wasn't just a military victory, it was the beginning of a radical reordering of English society, law, and governance that would define the modern world. The legacy of 1066 didn't stop at castles and courts. It set the stage for the rise of common law, royal justice, and the centralized state that England would become. But what happens when local tradition faces the overwhelming force of centralized power? And can a nation's identity survive under the weight of a foreign rule? The Norman Conquest in 1066 was a moment of violent transformation, but the consequences of that transformation weren't immediate. In the wake of William the Conqueror's victory, England's political, legal, and social structures were in disarray. The Anglo-Saxon elite had been displaced, and in their place, a new Norman aristocracy was established. Yet William's rule was not secure. The feudal system was in place, but the kingdom was divided by regional customs, local allegiances, and conflicting systems of justice. The Normans, after all, were foreign invaders, and while they conquered England militarily, they faced an uphill battle in consolidating their cultural and administrative hold. For decades after the Battle of Hastings, the Normans struggled to assert royal authority and control over the vast land of England. One of the most pressing challenges was the fragmented legal landscape where local laws and traditions held sway, often undermining the king's ability to govern uniformly.
It was in the 12th century under Henry II that the English monarchy began to develop a system capable of holding the kingdom together. A legal system that would replace the localized and varied legal traditions with a unified code. The birth of common law.
But could a single legal system truly unite the divided kingdom? And would Henry II's innovations bring order, or would they spark a backlash that would tear apart the fragile unity between the crown and the nobility? Before Henry II ascended the throne in 1154, England was governed by a patchwork of local customs and feudal laws. Justice wasn't uniform. It depended on where you lived, who you were, and how powerful your local lord was. Barons controlled their own courts, dispensing justice based on their own codes, while the church had its own ecclesiastical courts, dealing with matters of morality and marriage. Henry II understood that England's future depended on legal unity. To control his realm, he needed to ensure that justice wasn't decided by local lords, but by royal authority. This need for a centralized legal framework led to the establishment of royal courts and the appointment of royal justices to travel across the kingdom, making rulings based on royal law rather than local customs.
Under Henry II, the king's justices began to create a system of precedent-based law. When a case was decided, the judgment was recorded and served as a guideline for future rulings. This was a revolutionary step. It meant that the law was no longer about the whims of local lords or church courts, but a system that could be applied consistently across the kingdom. The foundation of common law was laid, where the principle of stare decisis, that past decisions should guide future ones, began to shape legal thinking in England. Common law wasn't just about creating a unified system for the elite. It was about creating a legal system that extended into every corner of England, from peasants to nobles. The courts of Henry II slowly transformed English law from a collection of disparate systems into a system of rights and responsibilities that laid the groundwork for the modern legal framework we know today. But as Henry consolidated royal justice, a new problem arose. The barons and the church weren't ready to give up their power. Could royal law survive the pressures of feudal rebellion and the church's influence?
As Henry II worked to centralize royal justice, he realized that no system of law could function without the resources to enforce it. And that's where the Exchequer came in. The Exchequer was a financial office created to ensure that the crown had enough funds to carry out its judicial and military obligations. But it wasn't just about collecting taxes. It was about creating a centralized financial system that supported the royal legal system. The Exchequer tracked income from the king's lands, revenues from the courts, and the taxes levied on the barons. This system of centralization was designed not just to fund Henry's court system, but to ensure that the crown remained financially independent of the barons. Through the Exchequer, Henry II could maintain control over both his finances and his legal system. The centralization of taxation and royal justice went hand in hand, as the funds collected were directly linked to the administration of justice. This meant that barons couldn't withhold money from the crown, and royal justices had the financial backing to enforce the king's will.
But with increasing centralization of power came increasing resentment. The barons were not about to sit idly by while royal authority expanded. Would Henry's centralized justice system provoke the feudal lords into outright rebellion? Or would they be forced to accept the king's new vision for a unified England? The Norman Conquest set in motion a series of changes that would ultimately define England's future. While the feudal system and the rise of castles were immediate consequences, it was the creation of common law and the centralized system of justice that would shape the course of English governance for centuries to come. The Exchequer and the royal courts created by Henry II ensured that the king's authority wasn't just based on force, but on a legal framework that governed every aspect of English society.
Though the barons and the church would continue to resist royal power, the seeds of modern governance, from parliamentary systems to legal precedent, were sown in this period. The legacy of common law, especially, would spread far beyond England, influencing legal systems across the world, from the United States to India.
What if the future of Europe was decided not on the battlefield, but in the courts? What if a single century-long struggle could irrevocably change the social structure, economy, and even the very identity of two of the most powerful nations in the world? The 100 Years' War, fought from 1337 to 1453, didn't just reshape England and France, it redefined them, forging the bedrock of the modern European state in ways never imagined by the kings or soldiers who fought. But what if, behind the bloodied banners and chivalric battles, a far more complex revolution was unfolding, one that would lead to the rise of nationalism, the dissolution of feudalism, and a new world order for medieval Europe? The 100 Years' War wasn't just a battle over land. It was a collision of dynastic ambitions, economic resources, and the changing power structures of medieval Europe. The war began when Edward III of England laid claim to the French throne, igniting a conflict that would stretch across generations and decimate both kingdoms. But while the war started as a dynastic struggle over the throne of France, it would evolve into a battle for the very soul of both nations.
In the early stages, England had the upper hand. Edward III and later his grandson Richard II used military brilliance to bring about key victories, especially with the revolutionary use of the longbow, a weapon that devastated French cavalry at the Battle of Crécy, and would continue to dominate throughout the war. Yet, despite military victories, England's grasp on French territory remained unstable. English claims to French lands were constantly contested by French monarchs and noble factions loyal to France. By the 15th century, the war had become a conflict of national survival. The French king's failure to unite his country against the English invaders gave rise to a new symbol, Joan of Arc, a young peasant woman who claimed divine intervention. Her intervention in the Siege of Orleans became a turning point, but the symbolic victory of Joan would also fuel the shift in French nationalism. But the impact of the war wasn't just about the battlefront. The war's financial strain, political challenges, and the redefinition of military power would forever change how Europe governed, fought, and conducted diplomacy. But the French resistance wasn't just about Joan's divine mission. There was a greater shift at play. Could the rising sense of French nationalism overwhelm centuries of feudal allegiances and royal infighting? And could England's military innovations in longbowmen and cavalry tactics win the war against the tide of social change in France?
The Battle of Agincourt, 1415, remains one of the most iconic moments of the 100 Years' War. In this legendary clash, King Henry V of England, commanding a much smaller force, crushed a vastly superior French army through sheer tactical brilliance. The English longbowmen, able to fire quickly and from a distance, decimated the French cavalry, marking a shift from the traditional knight-based warfare to a more modern military system. This battle became a symbol of English resilience, a small force triumphing against overwhelming odds. But the victory also redefined the future of warfare. The longbow, combined with new tactics, not only defeated the French at Agincourt, but it would also begin to shift the balance of power in England's military, marking the slow decline of the feudal knightly class. Despite the victory, the English were never able to hold the ground they conquered in France. The war was a reminder that military prowess could not overcome the will of a nation. The French military would eventually adapt, with new leaders and innovations, most notably the military genius of Joan of Arc,
who led French forces in a revitalizing charge.
With Joan of Arc's victories, England's hold on France began to slip, but the English were far from defeated. Could the French resurgence really threaten England's claim to French territory, or would English innovation on the battlefield still prove decisive? One of the most lasting impacts of the Hundred Years' War was the rise of English nationalism. The war helped unite a previously fragmented society under a common banner. The long and costly conflict was experienced by the people of England as a fight not just for the throne, but for the nation itself. As English soldiers fought and died in foreign fields, the idea of England as a unified nation began to take root. Henry V's victories at Agincourt, alongside the military leadership of his successors, gave rise to a new sense of pride and national unity. This national consciousness would help fuel the development of parliamentary democracy and lay the groundwork for a centralized English state that would emerge over the following centuries. The war also served as a critical backdrop to the evolution of English law and the political power of Parliament. Over time, the heavy cost of war led to increased calls for parliamentary representation, as English kings needed to secure funding from a more powerful parliament that had begun to demand more influence in national affairs. The rise of parliamentary power during this period paved the way for England's eventual shift toward a constitutional monarchy.
As English nationalism grew and Parliament's power expanded, how would the English monarchy adapt? Would national unity truly pave the way for a stronger state, one able to withstand both foreign invasions and domestic unrest? The Hundred Years' War was a massive economic drain for both England and France, but it had a particularly devastating effect on England. While the French economy was largely agricultural, England's economy was deeply tied to its merchants and trade networks, and the war disrupted these channels. The cost of maintaining armies, combined with the heavy burden of war taxes, placed incredible stress on the English working class and the land-owning nobility alike. In addition, the war led to a shift in social structures. The heavy taxation and widespread discontent sparked a number of peasant revolts throughout England. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, for example, was a direct result of the heavy taxation needed to fund the war. It represented a turning point in English social dynamics, as the feudal system began to erode and a more merchant-based society began to emerge. Economically, the war accelerated the decline of feudalism in England. With landowners increasingly reliant on mercenary forces and hired soldiers, the traditional system of vassalage began to break down. The rise of professional armies and centralized taxation further diminished the power of local lords and heralded the beginning of the rise of the modern state.
Could the collapse of feudalism lead to a more egalitarian society? Or would the pressures of war and social unrest lead to revolution in the heart of England? And how would England's new social order cope with the enduring legacy of the Hundred Years' War? The Hundred Years' War fundamentally reshaped England, France, and the rest of medieval Europe. The creation of a national identity for England, the rise of a centralized government, and the decline of feudalism laid the groundwork for the modern European state. But it wasn't just about the military victories or the territorial gains. It was about the deep social, cultural, and economic transformations that followed. The war not only shaped the political landscape of England and France, but it also influenced international relations for centuries to come. The rise of England as a unified nation, the military innovations that arose from the conflict, and the cultural shifts that followed would have a lasting impact on the history of Europe and beyond. The Hundred Years' War wasn't just a conflict between two kingdoms. It was the birthplace of a new Europe, one where nationalism would become the new force that drove nations to formulate their destinies, and where the age-old structures of feudalism would begin to fade into the past.
What if the enduring symbol of English liberty
was born not from the whims of a benevolent monarch, but from the defiance of a broken kingdom. A kingdom on the brink of collapse, with royal power at its height, and yet, through rebellion, the idea of parliamentary rule was born in the shadows of feudal oppression. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215, wasn't just a document. It was the first crack in the armor of royal absolutism, and it would lead to the slow-burning fire of English nationalism, the rise of Parliament, and the eventual rise of the English people as a force unto themselves. But what if the consequences of this document went much deeper than just political power? What if it marked the beginning of a conflict between the monarchy and the church, the seeds of which would eventually tear England apart? In 1215, King John of England stood at the height of his power, yet in the same year, the very foundation of royal authority would be shaken by baronial revolt. Unlike his more charismatic brother Richard the Lionheart, John had ruled through oppression, taxing his nobles into submission to fund costly wars. He failed to hold on to critical lands in France, and his reckless behavior alienated many of the kingdom's key power brokers.
The barons, the landowners and military leaders of England, were beginning to feel the weight of John's poor decisions. His aggressive taxation, disregard for customary rights, and the seizure of lands alienated them. The Magna Carta was their response, not just a demand for peace, but a demand for a new form of governance. It was born out of a struggle for control over English society, and in many ways it was less about limiting royal power and more about asserting the right of the nobility to govern themselves, free from arbitrary royal decrees. But here's where the twist comes. The barons were not unified in their purpose. They had competing interests, and their unity was one born of necessity, not allegiance. They needed to control John, but they also knew that they couldn't govern without his cooperation. The Magna Carta, then, was a compromise, a temporary truce between a struggling monarch and a nobility eager for more political power. Yet in creating this document, the barons planted the seeds of what would become the English Parliament. Would the barons maintain their foothold in governance, or would King John, despite his defeat, reclaim power? And more importantly, what long-term consequences would the Magna Carta have for English monarchy and for the future of English national identity?
The Magna Carta is often seen as a symbol of constitutional monarchy, a groundbreaking document that began the slow dismantling of absolute royal power. But its significance wasn't immediately clear. Signed under duress, King John was forced to concede to a set of conditions that limited his ability to exploit his nobles for personal gain. But the Magna Carta also set the stage for something far more profound. At its core, the Magna Carta was a political document, but it was also a legal one. It codified rights, making them not privileges granted by the crown, but inalienable rights that could not be arbitrarily revoked. Its most revolutionary clauses, such as the right to due process, protection from arbitrary taxation, and limits on the king's ability to seize land, laid the groundwork for what we know today as constitutional law. And though it was written by the barons for the barons, its impact would go far beyond the elite classes. The Magna Carta's clauses evolved, with many being reaffirmed by successive monarchs. However, its most crucial legacy was that it set the precedent that no one, not even the king, was above the law. It would take centuries for parliamentary democracy to fully evolve, but the Magna Carta provided the seeds for future revolutions, rising national identity, and collective governance.
But what happens when the very document that limits the king's power is ignored? Will the barons' victory over King John be short-lived, or will it serve as the beginning of a new age of English governance,
with Parliament as the ultimate ruler. In the decades following the Magna Carta, the English monarchy began to wrestle with the demands for more centralized power, but also with the growing calls for representation from its people. The barons had succeeded in limiting the king's absolute authority, but what followed was an inevitable power shift. King Henry III, John's son, was a weak monarch whose inability to maintain control over his kingdom led to growing demands for more representative governance. Parliamentary assemblies began to take shape in the 13th century, and by the time of Edward I, the monarchy had to acknowledge the rise of representative government, with the first English Parliament being formed, consisting of both nobles and commoners. Edward I's reign marked the beginning of parliamentary rule, where the monarchy was no longer the sole authority, and representatives of the people began to hold real political power. The Magna Carta's influence would echo through these early parliamentary movements, ultimately leading to the rise of the English Parliament as a force that could challenge royal power directly.
The rise of Parliament was inevitable, but would this newfound power of the people lead to absolute monarchy's downfall? And would England, now shaped by centuries of political struggle, be ready to embrace a more inclusive, representative future? The Magna Carta's ripple effects weren't just political. They helped forge an English identity that was defined by a shared history, common laws, and the growing belief that the people had a voice. The development of English identity was not a singular process. It was an intricate web involving the monarchy, the church, and the common people. For the monarchy, the Magna Carta represented a shift in legitimacy. It wasn't just about personal power anymore. Monarchs had to acknowledge the role of Parliament and the barons in governance. For the church, it represented a struggle for influence, as the document shifted the power dynamic even within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. However, it was the common people, the peasants, villagers, and urban workers, who would experience the most profound shift. The idea of legal rights and collective governance took root in the consciousness of the English population. The Magna Carta, by limiting royal power and introducing legal protections, laid the groundwork for a nation where power wasn't just held by the crown, it was shared.
As common people slowly gained more legal rights, how would England's evolving sense of national identity clash with the monarch's desire for absolute power? Would this rising identity lead to revolution, or would England's monarchy adapt to this new age of governance? The Magna Carta was the cornerstone of England's future. Its principles provided the foundation for constitutional monarchy and representative government. From the baronial resistance to the long-term rise of Parliament, the document laid the groundwork for a nation born of law, where the monarchy would eventually have to share power with the people. England's journey from feudalism to parliamentary rule was long and tumultuous, but the Magna Carta was the spark that began a process of transformation, shaping England's legal system, its identity, and its role in the wider world.
Imagine a world where kings ruled as absolute monarchs, where law was little more than a tool to serve the crown, and where no one, not even the noble or church, was safe from royal whim. Now imagine that world radically changing because of the fierce rebellion of barons, the formation of new laws, and a single document that set the stage for modern democracy. The Magna Carta wasn't just the foundation for English liberty, it was the spark for a new world order, one where parliamentary rule, common law, and individual rights would become the pillars of civilization. But what if I told you that the legacy of medieval England didn't just reshape Britain, it changed the fate of the world? From the birth of modern governance to the rise of global architecture, England's medieval transformation echoed across centuries. The question is,
How exactly did medieval struggles for power and social rebellion create the modern states, the public institutions, and the cultural identity we take for granted today? The Magna Carta is often seen as the beginning of English liberty, but its implications go far beyond the political turmoil of 1215. Medieval England wasn't just a kingdom. It was a living battlefield where the barons, monarchs, and commoners clashed over land, power, and justice. The feudal system, established after the Norman Conquest, was a way for the Norman elite to control and consolidate their newly acquired lands. But what if the feudal lords were not merely obeying the king's rule, but actively laying the groundwork for something far more profound?
Feudalism, as practiced in medieval England, was a tool of control, a system that kept the peasantry oppressed while the nobility enjoyed unprecedented power. But what made medieval England different was its slow, unrelenting transformation from a feudal society to something that began to resemble modern nationhood. The baronial revolt wasn't just about political power. It was about establishing the principle that law could not be arbitrary. The Magna Carta, signed under duress by King John, wasn't just about limiting royal power. It was a statement that no one, not even the king, was above the law. But could this revolutionary document, born from the desperation of rebellion, become more than just a piece of paper? Could it truly lay the foundation for a new type of governance? Or would it be ignored, and England would sink back into its old feudal ways? The Magna Carta was the first blow to absolute monarchy, but its long-term consequences were even more profound than its immediate political significance. The principles enshrined in the Magna Carta would not only reshape England's political system, but would go on to influence the development of Western legal systems for centuries. Common law, established under Henry II, was based on the idea that law should be applied equally to everyone, regardless of their status. This was an evolutionary step from the arbitrary rule of kings, where law was often based on personal whim.
By recognizing that the law could transcend individual rulers, England laid the groundwork for constitutional monarchy, the principle that sovereign power was limited by law, rather than being an absolute divine right. In the centuries that followed, England's political evolution would lead to the rise of Parliament, which eventually became the ultimate check on royal power, the very institution that King John had failed to control. Could this parliamentary system, birthed from a medieval rebellion, truly thrive against royal power and become the blueprint for modern democracies? Would other nations adopt England's model? Or would the rise of absolute monarchies elsewhere challenge the idea of limited government? While England's political systems evolved, so too did its physical landscape. The Norman Conquest brought a flood of Romanesque architecture to England, massive stone castles, fortifications, and cathedrals, designed not just for defense, but for symbolizing royal and church power. But it was the transition to Gothic architecture that would truly reshape how the English and Europeans would build cities, temples, and public spaces for the next centuries.
Gothic architecture, characterized by soaring spires, pointed arches, and flying buttresses, became a symbol of religious authority and the power of monarchy. Buildings like Westminster Abbey and Durham Cathedral became not only places of worship, but public demonstrations of institutional power. These structures communicated power, the crowns in its grand royal palaces and the churches in its cathedrals, marking their dominance over both spiritual and secular life. As Gothic styles dominated, how did these architectural innovations influence the way cities were built and public spaces designed in later periods? Were they merely symbols of power, or did they serve a deeper socio-political purpose? The legacy of medieval England isn't just found in its political systems or its legal frameworks.
It's also seen in the very essence of modern society. The struggle between power and the people, the development of collective rights, and the creation of shared governance. The Magna Carta and the rise of parliamentary rule didn't just influence England, they became the ideological foundation for democratic revolutions around the world, from the American Revolution to the French Revolution. Moreover, the architectural, social, and cultural transformations set in motion by the Norman and Gothic periods shaped the way we design our cities, our systems of power, and even our public rituals. The medieval struggle for justice, liberty, and representation laid the groundwork for modern political ideologies and cultural movements that would define the Age of Enlightenment and the rise of modern democracies.
As global democracy continues to evolve, what lessons can we take from the medieval struggle for power? Will the ideals of parliamentary governance and constitutional law continue to shape our future? Or will the old battle between absolute power and people's rights resurface with new force? The medieval period in England wasn't just an era of feudalism and war, it was the crucible in which modern political thought, legal systems, and cultural frameworks were forged. From the Magna Carta to the Gothic cathedrals, the conflicts and innovations of medieval England have shaped Western civilization in ways that are still felt today. As we look toward the future, we must ask, how much of today's world, our governance, our architecture, our values, was truly born in the struggle for power and justice that began in medieval England?
What if I told you that the freedoms and rights we take for granted today, individual liberties, parliamentary democracy, and justice for all, were not born in the Age of Enlightenment, nor in the 17th century, but in the muddy fields, the stone castles, and the blood-soaked battlefields of medieval England? From the ashes of rebellion and royal absolutism arose the very framework for modern Western society, and it all began in a kingdom that was, at first, fractured by war and oppressed by monarchs who ruled through fear, violence, and tyranny. The Norman Conquest of 1066 and the Magna Carta of 1215 did not simply mark historical milestones, they set the stage for the birth of modern governance, the development of constitutional law, and the enduring struggle for human rights that would echo throughout the centuries. But how did a divided medieval kingdom give birth to the pillars of our modern world? What unseen forces shaped medieval England into the landmark of governance and culture that it would become?
The evolution of medieval England from a fragmented feudal state to a centralized monarchy was anything but inevitable. The Norman Conquest, 1066, shook the very foundations of England's social, political, and legal systems. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom, though already evolving into something resembling modernity, was suddenly thrust into a new reality, one dominated by feudal lords, Norman aristocracy, and a monarch who wielded absolute power. The feudal system not only structured England's society around land and vassalage, it also introduced a new era of centralized control, where the king, despite his apparent supremacy, faced growing tensions from the barons and church, both of whom sought to limit his power. Fast forward to the early 13th century. The Anglo-Norman world was now a patchwork of entrenched feudal loyalties, growing resentment among landholders, and increasing demands for legal fairness. King John's overreach, the loss of French territories, heavy taxation, and arbitrary justice finally led to the Magna Carta of 1215. Far from a simple document, it was a revolutionary assertion of the idea that law governed all,
not just the king. The Magna Carta, born out of rebellion, created the space for the rise of Parliament. But it wasn't an immediate shift. The document's principles, especially the notions of limited royal power, due process, and taxation by consent, didn't come to fruition for generations. It was a symbolic victory for baronial resistance to monarchy, but its true legacy only unfolded in the centuries that followed.
The Magna Carta may have been signed in 1215, but did it truly mark the beginning of constitutional rule? Or was it just an empty promise that would only become meaningful when the people finally rose to demand real parliamentary governance? And would the Norman monarchy ever truly lose its stranglehold over the land? The Magna Carta, though often seen as the beginning of constitutional monarchy, was only the first chapter in a much larger story. It wasn't until the reign of Henry II in the late 12th century that the legal system began to evolve into what we recognize today as common law. Under Henry's leadership, the royal courts began to expand, and the idea that law should apply equally to everyone, even the king, began to take root. This legal framework, which emphasized the idea of precedent, was the beginning of a legal revolution that would eventually influence countries worldwide. The importance of the Magna Carta cannot be overstated. It marked the first time in European history that a monarch was forced to recognize that no one was above the law. It would inspire countless revolutions, including the American Revolution, where colonial leaders drew on its principles to create a government by the people, for the people. In the centuries that followed, English Parliament grew in power, shifting from a consultative body of nobles to a democratic institution that would represent the will of the people. This slow transformation culminated in the establishment of the constitutional monarchy, where the king could no longer rule by divine right, but only with the consent of the governed.
As parliamentary power grew and common law developed, would the monarchy willingly cede its power? Or would royal authority fight back, leading to the rebirth of English democracy under even more violent conditions? The stage was set for the Revolutionary War and the formation of modern states, but who would control the future of England's monarchy? Beyond politics and law, the Norman Conquest left an indelible mark on English architecture. The Norman Romanesque style, characterized by its sturdy stone walls, rounded arches, and massive proportions, was designed to convey strength and dominance. These structures, castles, churches, and cathedrals, were not just places of worship or defense. They were symbols of royal and ecclesiastical power that would define medieval England. Yet the evolution to Gothic architecture by the 13th century was even more revolutionary. The cathedrals built during this period were not just symbols of power, they were spaces that defined community and became focal points for the national consciousness. With their soaring spires and intricate stained glass, they captured the growing influence of the monarchy, the church, and the people.
By the time Westminster Abbey and Notre Dame Cathedral were constructed, the Gothic style was no longer simply about religious authority. It had become a marker of civic identity, with architecture symbolizing the unity of the nation, a stark contrast to the fragmented kingdoms of earlier times. But as Gothic architecture reshaped the very face of medieval society, how did these cathedrals, built to assert both royal power and divine authority, influence the future of public spaces in the Renaissance and modern cities? The medieval period in England was a time of profound change, a time when the foundations of modern law, governance, and cultural institutions were being set in motion. The Magna Carta, the rise of common law, the expansion of parliamentary rule, and the cultural influence of Norman and Gothic architecture
weren't just milestones in England's history, they were revolutionary forces that influenced the entire Western world. What began as a battle for legal rights and political power transformed into the global ideals of democracy, rule of law, and national identity. From the Magna Carta to the Gothic spires, the influence of medieval England is still with us today.
Medieval England didn't just pave the way for modern democracy and law, it crafted the framework for a world where power could be shared, debated, and challenged. The long-lasting legacy of medieval England shaped global governance, from the rise of constitutional monarchies to the emergence of democratic ideals in places like the United States and France. It was a world built from the struggles of kings and peasants alike, from rebellions to revolutions, and from a deeply feudal society to the rise of modern systems of governance. Through its enduring institutions, artistic achievements, and human experiences, the medieval period was the crucible in which modern civilization was formed. The impact of medieval England is undeniable, and its legacy will continue to shape the world for generations to come.
The journey through medieval England is far from over. The echoes of its battles, laws, and culture still resonate today, shaping how we live, govern, and interact with the world. If you've learned something new, or were surprised by how much medieval England has influenced our modern world, hit that like button. Let us know your thoughts. What part of medieval history shocked you the most, and how do you see it playing out in today's world? Subscribe for more deep dives into the past, because the story of history is never finished. It's only just beginning.